Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk once again on a very important topic, though we have discussed a lot in our previous session yesterday. But taking the lecture forward, we believe that we are going to give you more information. So friends, today's topic of discussion is critical study of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Debasri Basu. Dr. Debasri Basu is an assistant professor and she is the subject expert of English and is teaching in one of the leading institutions of the country. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Debasri Basu on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. A critical study of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels. This is the topic of discussion, and friends, for the discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Debasri Basu. So I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Basu once again. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. Okay, so to begin with, continue with where we had left yesterday. Today's topic of discussion once again will deal with critical analysis of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and the focus will primarily be on the political significance of the prose satire and Swift's use of fantasy as one of the important literary devices. The main intention of a satirist, as I have repeated yesterday already, is to expose and criticize the folly, vice and depravity of mankind, not with the intention of only criticizing individuals or mankind per se, but primarily with the intention to rectify and enlighten mankind. For this, Swift employed a whole range of satirical techniques, which included hilarious comedy, mock heroic approach, or a grim irony. Swift's satire, specifically Gulliver's Travels, excels in defamiliarizing the realities of society, only to reveal them to us with greater intensity. The four imaginary lands that Gulliver visits are imaginative transformation of social realities of contemporary England and other European countries. In the first two books, the description of the fantastic lands is based on the idea of proportion, dimension, size and measurement to the world of Gulliver's around him. Gulliver's immensity compared to the Lilliputians and his minuteness compared to the Brobdingnagians provide ample scope for fictional incidents that have great symbolic and satiric connotations. The comic episodes describing Gulliver's problems of excretion, removal of his dung, the difficulties about his eating, drinking and lodging all appear to be fantastic incidents. However, they all indicate the realistic position of man, especially the discrepancy between the greater working of man's mind and the awkward behavior of his body. Through the fantastic episodes of the court intrigues, petty politics and factionalism, Swift uses satire to criticize the politically corrupt and confused state of affairs of contemporary England. The psychological stuntedness of the Lilliputians is surfaced through their ungrateful behavior when they shoot arrows towards Gulliver and conspire to execute him despite all the help that he extended towards them during their war with Blefuscu. Ruthlessness is an essential part of the Lilliputians, and blinding an offender is considered to be a meager punishment. So much so that when Gulliver's only Lilliputian friend, Reldresal, comes to his rescue, it is proposed that he is blinded as a gesture of mercy. Even the most absurd episode of burning the dead upside down is a parody of the idea of resurrection. In Book 2, the fantasy based on size and proportion is reversed, whereby Gulliver is reduced to a tiny creature in the land of the giants. He is easily frightened by the monstrous size of a cat, the frog that covers him with odious slime, the monkey that attacks him, and the bird that tries to carry him away. Fantasy is employed not only to describe the land, but also the human world inhabited by the protagonist, to exaggerate his behavior, the horror, the obnoxiousness of the real world that gets superimposed in the fantastic description of the Brobdingnagian island. Ironically, the island of the Brobdingnags appear to be a fantasy of horror and terror to Gulliver, who is struck with fear by their physical hugeness. This is surfaced by the huge cancerous tumor that he sees on a beggar woman's breast, lice in a beggar's hair, and body odor of the maid of honor. The fantasy in this book is therefore a double-edged sword to expose the crudity of man's body on one hand and the depravity of his mind on the other. Book 3 comprises of a science fiction fantasy, parodying the intellectual pursuits, aspirations and abstractions encouraged by the Royal Society of England. Science, divorced from reality, becomes a sublimation of absurdity, in which the greatest experimentation is done on useless things which have no relevance towards the progression or betterment of mankind. Swift's direct attack against the Royal Society is through the Academy of Professors in Laputa, who invent natural laws by trying to extract sunbeams from cucumbers, food from excrements, and building houses with roof downwards. The concept of the flying island of Laputa may appear to be fantastic in nature, but in reality it points out to England's tyrannical control over colonies and the English government's indifference to Irish problems. Moreover, the fantastic description of Glubbdubdrib, the island of the sorcerers, points towards the practice of necromancy or black magic, representing the incredible imaginary creation of immortal creatures who are ironically more melancholic, impotent and envious rather than being happy. Through them, Swift exposes the perverse human desires of achieving power over spirits and hankering after eternal earthly life. Book 4 is the most fantastic of all, using the age-old mythical concept of half-man, half-beast creature like the Sphinx or the satyr. However, there is a quantitative combination rather than a physical blend of man and beast. The Hunims are a rare breed of horses possessing human reason, society-building capacities, intellectualism and orderliness. On the other hand, the Yahoos, possessing human form, have all the bestial qualities. They are barbaric, they are amoral, they are filthy, with obnoxious excretory habits. In this book, fantasy appears to be farthest from human rationale, bringing Gulliver closest to self-revelation. His loathing for the Yahoos is a form of self-disgust. Man uses his clothes and civilized institutions to suppress his animality. Gulliver's subsequent insanity results from being unable to integrate the rational and the impulsive facets of man. He fails to understand that despite the rational ideal, the horses are cold and unemotional even towards their spouses and children. Now, this brings us to a very important dimension in Gulliver's Travels, specifically with reference to Book 4, and that is whether Gulliver's Travels has a dark look towards humanity or not. Now, as the PPT suggests, the slide here, parts of Gulliver's Travels are funny and parts are dark and pessimistic. The original purpose to satirize is to satirize the foolishness of modern man, who thinks himself to be exceptionally sophisticated, dignified and refined, and yet he most of the time cannot go above and beyond his bodily needs. Do we notice anything critical of human beings yet? Of course we do, because through the portrayal of the Yahoos, who are considered to be very base and filthy creatures by the Hunims, who are by virtue animals and quadrupeds, we do see Swift presenting a scathingly critical dimension of human beings. Gulliver seems to become a misanthrope, as the PPT shows, primarily with reference to Book 4 of Gulliver's Travels, which has often invited a lot of criticism from the critics, fundamentally because of the fact that the representation of human beings in this book is exceptionally debased and scathingly critical, which brings to our mind one specific quality, and that is whether Gulliver has become a misanthrope, and by virtue of that, by extension of which, is Swift a misanthrope either? Swift views human beings pessimistically, which is true. Now, is Gulliver an idealist or is he a misanthrope? This is another question which needs to be addressed, that are we to deal with Gulliver only as a misanthrope? Because we see his gradual change, transformation from an enthusiastic, naive explorer to a rather pessimistically cynical misanthrope. Gulliver's conversation with horses, Gulliver gives up forever his visionary schemes. Now, coming back then, in Book 2, once again, if again we go back to coming to Book 4 again, sorry, it is the fantastic of all that I have said, and it brings Gulliver closest to self-revelation to the fact that human beings, even though considered to be the most civilized, rational, sophisticated of all, cannot rise above their bestial, base instincts most of the time, which is something that gets vehemently and scathingly attacked by Swift through the entire course of Book 4 of Gulliver's Travels. So, therefore, fantasy over here becomes a realistically literary device. The fantasy is thus an aspect of realism which enables the author to charm and delight the readers, while at the same time enlightening them with the harsh truth of human nature that is not above and beyond criticism. Now, Gulliver's Travels is primarily celebrated as a political satire and a social satire as well. There are several characters throughout the 4 books of Gulliver's Travels who have been modelled on contemporary political figures, men and women of power during Swift's time. So, the focus of the next section would be the political significance across the 4 books in Gulliver's Travels. The novel contains a substantial degree of allusions to contemporary political personalities and events. In one of his earlier writings, Swift says, and I quote him, "In describing the virtues and vices of mankind, it is convenient to have some eminent person in our eye from whence we copy our description." Unquote. The references to public events and personages are most frequent in books 1 and 3. Each of these books consists of a part which was written around 1714. The laws and customs of Lilliputs, described in chapter 6 of book 1, shows a distinct change of tone with a serious didactic purpose. As soon as Swift focuses on the political scenario of Lilliputs, it ceases to be the utopia and becomes England itself, which was paralyzed at that point of time with a lot of economic as well as political and social pressures. Gulliver's mortal enemy is a certain Lord Bolgolam. The morose and sour complexion attributed to Bolgolam is at once suggests the identification with the Earl of Nottingham, whose complexion, and I quote again, disposeth him to vigour and severity. In 1711, when Nottingham had joined the Whigs in their attack on the foreign policy of the government, let me stop here for a while and remind you that Swift had begun his career as a supporter of Whig, but later on he became a political pamphleteer for the Tories. When Nottingham had joined the Whigs in their attack on the foreign policy of the government, Swift had written 2 poems against him. Nottingham had retaliated by using his influence at the court to stop Swift's promotion and then had openly condemned him in the Parliament. Swift, throughout his career, throughout his life, had always believed that he had somehow irked the anger of people and men in power and position during his time, who tried their level best to make Swift struggle throughout his life as far as his career is concerned. So, neither could Swift have a successful career in church, nor could he have a successful career in politics, because he somehow managed to, ironically, antagonize certain people in power during his time, and Nottingham essentially was one of them. The parallel between the fate of Bolingbroke and Gulliver in Book 1 of Gulliver's Travels is very close and bears a striking resemblance. Like Gulliver, Bolingbroke had brought a great war to an end and concluded peace upon conditions very advantageous to his country, but was denounced for not prosecuting the war to the complete subjugation of the enemy. He was accused of treason with the ambassador of France, as Gulliver was with that of Blefuscu. During his exile, several long letters were exchanged between Swift and Bolingbroke, confirming their acquaintance. The character of Flimnap, Book 1, Gulliver's Travels, is quite obviously modelled on Sir Robert Walpole, who is historically considered to be the first pronounced Prime Minister of Britain. Flimnap's skill of dancing on tight rope symbolizes Walpole's dexterity in parliamentary tactics and political intrigues. When Flimnap, after an attempted jump, falls down, he is saved from breaking his neck by the king's cushion. This cushion is intended to symbolize the Duchess of Kendal, who was one of King George I's mistresses, and by whose influence Walpole was restored to royal favour after his fall from power in 1717. The silk threads awarded to the courtiers, showing greatest agility in leaping over or creeping under a stake, symbolize English distinctions. The green thread represented the Order of the Thistle, revived by Queen Anne in 1703. The red thread represented the Order of the Bath, initiated by King George I in 1725, and the blue thread represented Order of the Garter, which was bestowed upon Walpole in 1726, the year in which Gulliver's Travels was published. In Book 3, the rebellion of the people of one of the cities against the Laputan king in Chapter 4 has been interpreted as an allegorical account of the successful resistance of Ireland to William Wood's halfpence. Now, this was a significant, essential political development and a remarkable example of political dissent and resistance during Swift's time, which obviously has a very important role to play in Book 3 of Gulliver's Travels, symbolically and metaphorically. In 1722, William Wood had paid handsomely to the Duchess of Kendal for a patent to mint copper halfpence and farthings for Ireland. However, soon the Irish protested against the poor quality, and eventually the patent was withdrawn in 1725. Also, at the end of the same chapter, the readers observe that neither the king nor his sons were permitted to leave the island, referring to the Act of Settlement in 1701, which stated that the English king could only leave the country with the consent of the Parliament. The character of Munody has been often identified with Viscount Middleton, who was the Lord Chancellor of Ireland and who, although a Whig, opposed the halfpence. In Chapter 11, Book 3, Gulliver's Travels, a reference is made to contemporary regulation in Japan, requiring all European travellers arriving there to trample upon the crucifix. And one can very well understand the the substantial degree of humiliation that it caused to a certain religious sect at that point of time. The name Amboina features in a very big way in Book 3 of Gulliver's Travels, which is in the book a Dutch ship that Gulliver boards in order to go to Amsterdam. But it is actually a reminder of the massacre of Englishmen by the Dutch in Amboina, which was situated in East Indies in 1623. The history of the identification of Nottingham as Skyresh Bolgolam is distinguished but unconvincing. As one can see in the slides, satire of politics and politicians, because of course politically it's a very heavily loaded political text. So here are some of the characters who were modelled on exceptionally scathing satirical attacks of Gulliver. So the first in the list is Skyresh Bolgolam, who was pleased without provocation to be Gulliver's mortal enemy. Next, Flimnap, and Gulliver says, "This was the first time I began to conceive some imperfect idea of courts and ministers." Rumours were there among politicians who were accusing Gulliver of having an affair with a fine lady. The history of the identification of Nottingham as Skyresh Bolgolam is distinguished but unconvincing. Based on Swift's reference to his morose and sour complexion, conjuring up the contemporary nickname habitually applied to Nottingham, and that was of dismal successive commentators have participated in some amazing gymnastics to find data in a voyage to Lilliput to support their conclusions. Swift was none too friendly with Nottingham, but Nottingham was never in the Admiralty during the period in question, while Bolgolam was Lord High Admiral of Lilliput. So, despite the fact that there are real life incidents and real life figures on whom the characters throughout the 4 books of Gulliver's Travels are modelled, there are some historical misinformations, misdocumentations here and there, which certain critics have pointed out. References to the period when Nottingham did act as First Lord of the Admiralty from 1680 to 1684 seem forced, and so does similar ones relating to his interest in naval affairs in the first half of 1690s. Now, how are these to be reconciled with Swift's categorical statement that Bolgolam was very much in his master's confidence and a person well versed in affairs? Nottingham was Lord President of the Council under King George I, but only until the aftermath of the 15th Rebellion. Now, note on 15th Rebellion. 15th Rebellion is a reference to the Jacobite rising that took place in 1715, which was an attempt of James Francis Stuart to regain the thrones of England, Ireland and Scotland for the House of the Stuarts. On 29th February 1716, Nottingham was dismissed from office. Therefore, all attempts to label Nottingham as a Whig are vain. He was a high Tory. He gained office as a result of his apostasy in December, when he led the motion in the Lords for a declaration of no peace without Spain as a ruse to secure Whig approval of an occasional conformity. The topicality of Gulliver's Travels has been highlighted by an examination to a voyage to Laputa. As Lord Chancellor of Ireland, Viscount Middleton had stood out against William Wood's patent. He caused Walpole's displeasure and was threatened with dismissal. I am coming back once again to the halfpence movement, which was resisted by the Irish people, because it covers a significant portion of book 3 of Gulliver's Travels. Swift's main complaint in practical terms about Wood's halfpence was that for many years the minting of milled coin had been authorized by the Lord Chancellors of Ireland in sufficient quantities when needed without flooding the market with money. Ensuring by moderate measures that there was no real scarcity of coin, the Lord Chancellor, the character of Munodi is modelled on him, had minted enough money to cater for the requirements of the English population of Ireland, which symbolized his own family in the book, and the Irish themselves, symbolized by his tenants in the book. Now interfering with this happy state of affairs, money was to be minted in England, to be used in Ireland, and in quantities that threatened to result in an excess of small coins. And this adverse step was surely hinted at when the mill is under discussion. There is an entire episode in book 3 where Gulliver talks about the description of a mill, and this mill can very well metaphorically be connected to this entire minting process of William Wood's halfpence, copper minted coins and farthings. The supposition that Milton is Swift's hero, Munodi is supported by his advice to consult annals and compare dates. 1723 was the peak of Middleton's opposition to Wood's patent, when he had to give way to Walpole. 2 years later, the government revoked the earlier decision and cancelled Wood's patent. Then is there a parallel here between Middleton's conduct and that of Munodi? If Legado is meant to symbolize Ireland, then Munodi's governorship could be the Lord Chancellorship. According to Gulliver, Munodi, pressed by many of his friends, complied with the proposal, and after employing 100 men for 2 years, the work miscarried, the projectors went off, laying the blame entirely upon him. Here apparently are the 2 years between 1723 and 1725, during which Wood's patent was operational. Perhaps the allegory is not consistent, but when the mill is under discussion, it would appear that Munodi is to be identified as Middleton, and this suggests that Swift was to some extent concentrating on Irish affairs as Middleton, and on Irish affairs in the much more fragmented voyage to Laputa. Now, I would rather like to see Gulliver's Travels and emancipated from political arguments for the sake of a wider social cause and a social reality. Swift expected Gulliver's Travels would wonderfully mend the world. It is the timeless quality of social and not political satire that has made Gulliver's Travels a classic today, and it's exceptionally relevant in modern contemporary political scenario as well. Taken to its logical conclusion, this argument assumes that Bolgolam, Reldressel, Munodi, even Flimnap become types, symbols, not actual personalities, and that Gulliver's Travels is more readily digested than this. So, when we talk about a classic example of a literary piece, whether it's a novel, whether it's a drama, whether it's a satire, prose satire as in this case, we should always consider the relevance of it socially rather than only politically, because it is the social significance of the text that actually makes it a classic, makes it relevant, timeless and universal, as we see in Gulliver's Travels. We will continue the rest part of the lecture and the next half of the break. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you're requested to be with us as we are back after a short break, and we promise to give you more and more of information and knowledge. Till then, keep watching us. Thank you so very much. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on a critical study of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Debasri Basu. Dr. Debasri Basu is assistant professor and she is teaching in one of the leading institutions of the country. Through her we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics and issues of English, and friends, we believe that today also you are gathering maximum. If you wish to ask questions from Dr. Debasri Basu on today's topic, then do call us to our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. You are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture so that first you could have more and more knowledge on the topic, and yes, of course, we promise to give answers to your questions in the last 10 minutes through Dr. Debasri Basu. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Basu, once again, and would request her to continue further.
Thank you. So, to continue from where we had left the other side of the break, I would like to again say that Gulliver's Travels has not become timeless and universal because it is a politically significant text, but it has primarily become so because it is a social satire as well. Swift expected that his travels would wonderfully mend the world. Wonderfully mend the world is a phrase that I am quoting from Gulliver's Travels itself. It is a timeless quality of the social, not political satire that makes the work relevant to the modern reader. Taken to its logical conclusion, then this argument assumes that all those characters in Gulliver's Travels, throughout the 4 books in Gulliver's Travels, who've been modelled on contemporary political figurants, become types, symbols, metaphors, and not remain mere individuals, and that Gulliver's Travels becomes more readily digested, becomes more readily absorbed in the process. To Book 3. Swift composed Voyage 3 after he had completed Voyages 1, 2 and 4. The first 2 voyages satirize the root of man's physical pride, and the last voyage summarizes in extreme form satire on the roots of both physical and intellectual pride. Clearly, if the pattern is to be complete, there must be a voyage in between to give an extended criticism of mankind's intellectual inadequacies. The precision with which Book 3 fulfills this requirement has not always been recognized. Book 3 has, ironically, been marginalized to the most, dismissed as a mere science fiction fantasy, where obsessive, absurd, meaningless intellectual pursuits are taken by mad and insane scientists. But it is more than that. It is not just a filler that fills a gap between Voyages 2 and 4, but it is also with such precision and brilliant seamlessness that Swift has been able to fill the gap. It is worthy of admiration and attention. Swift does more than attack the excesses of would-be scientists. He attacks science itself. He did not trust science because, according to him, science should have helped in the progression, in the betterment, in the evolution and the evolvement of mankind in every possible terms, in positive terms, in affirmative terms. But the Royal Society of England, the kind of experimentations and innovations that the Royal Society of England was involved during Swift's time, it made him all the more disgusted and detached from science because he felt that they were all based on the whims and fancies of the then people who were in power, who considered themselves to be sophisticated, intellectually proud and supreme. Paradoxically enough, this does not mean that Swift opposed scientific investigation, particularly when it might lead to useful discoveries. There is evidence enough that he did not. It does mean, however, that as a conservative churchman, he recognized that man's analytic use of his intellect is an attempt to examine and manipulate the natural world is one of the best possible examples of the sin of pride in action, something that Gulliver himself is guilty of. In all his naive or wonderment, which he sees and visits these imaginary lands one after the other, in his naivety, we also see a certain kind of a superiority complex, quote unquote, if I am allowed to use this word, a sense of intellectual pride, a sense of pride that comes from the fact that I am a man, I am a human being, which is something that is being scathingly criticized by Swift, because the same Gulliver, the same protagonist, Swift also allows to undergo a certain kind of degeneration where he becomes a prototype, he becomes an eye-opener for us readers to understand that there is more to man than just being sophisticated and reformed. The satire on ivory tower abstractionism in Laputa and on the ridiculous excesses of Ballyburby is too well understood to need discussion here. The next short voyages to Glubbdubdrib and Lugnag are not as obviously related to the satire on science and learning, and all of part 3 is sometimes thought to be fragmentary on this account. There are a lot of transitional shifts, a lot of geographical shifts when it comes to book 3 of Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver travels from one land to the other within the parameter, within the space of book 3 of Gulliver's Travels. In spite of first appearances, however, they have played an important part in the development of the central theme of the prose satire. Gulliver's short sightseeing trip to Glubbdubdrib seems actually to have been devised carefully in order to continue the satire of the preceding episodes. The curious ghost-raising powers of the governor of the island permit Gulliver to make an exact comparison of the virtues of the ancients and the moderns. This is a natural extension of a satire on the intellectual pretensions of 18th century scientists, since the English quarrel of the ancients and the moderns was partly in terms of ancient and modern learning. Gulliver's emotions are at a dead center in part 2. The strictures of the King of Brobdingnag had more effect on Gulliver than is always recognized. They made him admit indirectly that he was uneasy as to whether European society was quite as perfect as he had previously thought it was. So, despite the fact that Gulliver is not exactly a mouthpiece of Jonathan Swift, because Swift makes Gulliver an object of his criticism, an object of his satire as well, but there is a marked distinction, a marked change in the character of Gulliver if we look at his graph from book 1 till the end of book 4, where Gulliver, who had initially begun with a lot of enthusiasm and with a lot of sense of importance as far as European countries, as far as Britain, England are concerned, somehow dodges in book 3, in book 2 and book 3, and realizes that not everything is perfect, relevant and significant and beautiful and important as England, as the vision of England that he had seen. Thus Gulliver became, by the time he embarked on his third voyage, more reserved and objective as a detached observer of man and manners. This detachment, however impermanent, allowed Swift to push on Gulliver's education at a rapid pace. It was natural for Gulliver, during this crucial period in the development of his character, to have a relatively open mind. It did not last long. But while it lasted, Gulliver learnt a great deal. The experimental evidence on comparative morality, which he collected on Glubbdubdrib, was particularly influential. Its impact on him represents an important climax in his development. After this, he set out on his fourth voyage, already convinced that human society was to a large extent corrupt and immoral. He was probably still an optimist, for want of a better philosophical position to turn to, but he had become cynical and worldly in his own peculiar manner. This is just what Swift wanted, a realistic, believable course of character development. And that is why he did not whitewash the character of Gulliver at all. And also the reason more that we do not consider Gulliver as Swift's mouthpiece, because he is not. He is a fallible, gullible character. And in his fallibility, in his gullibility, lies his humaneness, lies the realistic portrait of Gulliver, which is one of the significant dimensions that Swift could have given to his protagonist. It leads from naivety and gullibility to that sort of superficial disillusionment and sophistication which he considered to be the state of most of the fashionable wits. When the Houyhnhnms finally broke down this sophistication and the natural gullible protagonist saw that all experience cut the ground from under everything he believed in, he gave up humanity for lost and refused to give any faith or affection to anything but the inhuman moral and intellectual ideal represented by the Houyhnhnms. And this is something which I believe makes Swift more brutally critical, scathingly critical towards Gulliver. Because though Gulliver is considered to be a misanthrope, and by extension many critics have also considered Swift to be a misanthrope, his detest for mankind, his hatred towards mankind, and he has been constantly branded and categorized as a misanthrope. But somewhere down the line, there is a subtle difference between Gulliver and Swift. Gulliver shut him out from humanity. He completely refused to believe and trust that there can be any redemption for mankind. But for Swift, human beings were not entities who were damaged beyond repair. That is not something that Swift essentially believed in. It is easy to exaggerate the weakness of the third voyage. There is, after all, no fundamental change in the method of satire. And as for its intensity, only one situation, that on the island of the ghosts, is notably weak. This weakness and other lesser weaknesses are unfortunate. However, judgments of this sort should not obscure the fact that part 3 as a whole is very necessary for both the satiric and fictional structure of Gulliver's Travels. Coming to the fourth book of the novel. Gulliver's Travels has, to be sure, been seen the object of much discussion, book 4 that is. Yet some of the criticism, I think, has been obscured by certain misunderstandings of the structure of satire and by insufficient attention to the changing response to satire. The last 2 chapters on which a large part of the discussion concentrates can yield a wide range of interpretations. One can demonstrate by judicious choice of passages, images, actions and words that Gulliver is mad or sane, that his madness is a light-hearted joke or a deadly horror, that he is sane but an object of satire, or that he is not only sane but is Swift's spokesperson, showing the acute vision of a satirist. And one can come to several apparently contradictory conclusions depending on one's evaluation of Gulliver about the meaning of the work, that Gulliver's liver's insanity shows the Houyhnhnm ideal to be dangerous and undesirable, that Gulliver's irrational behavior results from his pride in thinking that such an ideal is easily attainable, or that Gulliver's denunciation of pride and low opinion of mankind reflects an attitude similar to Swift's. At times in these last 2 chapters of book 4, Swift endows Gulliver with images that imply madness by almost any standard. When Gulliver is restrained from jumping overboard only by the threat of the chains, when he cannot bear to let a tailor take his measurement, when he falls in a swoon for almost an hour at the touch of his wife, when he talks with horses when he is fearful of every human's teeth and claws. His actions at other times, if not those of madness, are extremely odd, foolish, eccentric or petty, certainly not admirable. If one considers Gulliver to be mad, then the madness should not be seen as the solemn and terrible dehumanization of the narrator protagonist that modern criticism has described. There has been several conclusions and deductions made in order to metaphorically, in order to symbolize that what does Gulliver's insanity, madness, stands for. It could be an exaggeration on Swift's part, but there is something more to it than just the physical way of representing madness and insanity. But it is also something which is rather funny. So, the humor and the wit underlying fourth book, which is otherwise considered to be the most dark, the most scathingly critical, divorced of any kind of humor and any kind of wit, is to a certain extent a misconception and a misinterpretation. Jokes about the Hunims in Gulliver's Travels are part of this tone. Swift is saying here that if you think that reason is sufficient to do everything, let it thread a needle. You may as well ask a horse to do it. So, it is not just by making the Hunims the rational beings and the Yahoos the irrational and filthy creatures that he is actually subverting the entire social ladder of the man and the beast. But what he is also essentially trying to do is the ridiculousness and the absurdity of the situation is essentially humorous, ironical, funny and witty. And that, the wit dimension of book 4 has somehow got eclipsed, has got lost in a constant deliberation towards a very deep dark side of it. We have missed the mark, we have missed the ability to appreciate the underlying humor which features in a very big way in the final volume of Gulliver's Travels. Even the severe attacks made on mankind in the description of the Yahoos can be taken as one amusing point of view, provided, of course, that the reader does not take it as the only point of view. Man can be seen as a doll, a monstrous giant, a crazy scientist or a wild animal. And Gulliver has become a comic figure through much of Gulliver's Travels, including his stay in Hunimland, as in his solemn defense of man as cleaner than pigs. That Gulliver fails to behave like a Hunim as soon as he meets the first challenge, that the human he rails about really behave more rationally than he does, that he exemplifies pride as he denounces it, are all parts of the joke. So, Gulliver's madness at the end is consistent with a light tone throughout. I find it difficult to believe that Swift would have expected the reader to take the fainting, raving, horse smell loving, human tooth and claw fearing Gulliver with an entirely straight face. Swift is saying that if we really think man is already a rational animal and are surprised every time he acts otherwise, we soon will be mad ourselves. Because it is not the rationality of the human beings that he is criticizing over here. He is actually criticizing our inability.
To stop you over here because we have a caller right now. Hello.
Hello, good morning, ma'am.
Yes, good morning. Please tell your name and ask a question.
Yes, ma'am, my name is Pawan.
Yes, Pawan, what is your question?
Actually, ma'am, I want to know that what kind of human was Gulliver was. Actually, I want to know, ma'am, I want to know characteristic of Gulliver.
You want to know the characteristics of Gulliver, what kind of person he was, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, yes.
Yes, he just wanted to know the characteristics of Gulliver, what kind of the person he was, what kind of writings, though we can read through the...
Yeah, right. Actually, you see, essentially, I mean, Gulliver being the narrator protagonist, obviously he features throughout the 4 books in Gulliver's Travels, and from book 1, when we see Gulliver for the first time, he is a very naive explorer, a navigator who just wants to see this, who just happens to visit this imaginary land of the Lilliputians. But as and when we see him in books 2, 3 and 4, we see a marked change in his character transformation, and from a naive, innocent, awestruck navigator, he becomes more dark, more deep, more layered as a character. And as and when Swift gives him more dimensions, more layers to his characters, he becomes equally fallible. His gullibility as a person, the fact that he believes everything that he sees very easily without being capable of actually analyzing and evaluating it with a rational mind, makes Gulliver all the more a very ironic and a comic figure in our eyes, because we make an essential mistake of considering Gulliver as a mouthpiece of Swift. He is not so. He is also an object of satire of Swift, by Swift, and that is why through Gulliver's change in transformation, the fact that he is so uptight about human rational, about the fact that human beings are very rational, sophisticated and dignified people, but he himself is incapable of doing so. So, the characteristic features of Gulliver is very ridiculously comic at one point, and also on the other hand is also very realistic and fallible, just like any other human being who is a mixture of limitations, weaknesses as well as some redeemable qualities. So, I hope it answers your question.
Yes, yes, dear friends, we believe that you might have get answer of your question, and we feel that you should keep calling us and keep asking the questions and watching the lectures too. So, ma'am, let's continue further as we have some time left with us.
So, we find Gulliver's rejection of all mankind because it fails to live up to some abstract ideal, disturbingly similar to 20th century anti-human ideology. The arguments which claim that Swift intended Gulliver to be taken as mad, ridiculous and object of satire not only defend Swift against holding beliefs most of us find horrendous, but grant his greatest work the status of a prophetic satire, makes it a work in which Swift makes the readers see things that seem terrifying, but with a lot of clarity, that he was able to foresee the logical results of events in his own time. It seems to me that a good bit of trouble would be avoided if we admitted that satire allows for two mutually helpful but essentially independent approaches. One, in which we see the satire in relation to its own time, as a work that reflects the socio-political conditions of the age in which it is written, and another in which we see it like all our great art is, something that is forever universal and relevant and acceptable. So, in his description of the societies Gulliver visits, Swift carefully elucidates the relationship which exists in that society between the present and the past. In chapter 6, after describing the institutions of Lilliput, Gulliver adds, I quote, "In relating these and the following laws, I would be understood to mean the original institutions and not the most scandalous corruptions into which these people are fallen by the degenerate nature of man." Unquote. The events of Book 1 define the particular kind of degeneracy involved. Corruptions have grown, Gulliver concludes, by the gradual increase of party and faction. The same is true in Book 3. Of those whom Gulliver meets in Book 3, the most sympathetically portrayed is Munodi, the Lord of Bolingbroke. Though the surrounding countryside shows not one ear of corn or blade of grass, Munodi's estate can boast of vineyards, cornfields and meadows. His house is a noble structure built according to the best rules of ancient architecture, and its fountains, gardens, walks, avenues and groves were all disposed with exact judgment and taste. Here very briefly we find suggested the kind of culture Swift admired and in defense of which he wrote Gulliver's Travels. If Lilliput had been corrupted by greed, by lust for power, by faction, then Bolingbroke has been corrupted by an idea which Swift hated, that any change is a change for the better. In contrast to Lilliput and Bolingbroke, Brobdingnag, Gulliver is careful to tell us, provides an example of the kind of society that men can achieve if they are virtuous. Among those nations where Yahoos preside, he says, meaning among nations run by men, the least corrupted are the Brobdingnagians, whose wise maxims in morality and government would be our happiness to observe. Gulliver, who by the time he gives this advice has lived among the completely rational, the glorious Hunims, is surely telling us that the best thing man can do is to try for a government like that of Brobdingnag. For the Brobdingnagians have been able to preserve the moral order and have held in check, though not of course completely overcome, their own Yahoo-ness. To sum up, Gulliver's Travels is an especially clear example of the error of modern criticism of satire, which says that in satire standards of judgment are inaudible, or that in satire the reader is sure what the author's attitude is or what his own attitude is supposed to be. And much of the criticism in Gulliver's Travels, which insists that a single meaning be attached to the work or that it be approached from a single point of view, seems to be a limited and unwitting demonstration of the single vision which Swift himself denounces. The almost unlimited diversity of the final chapter, the playful variations, the shifts of personality, the alternations of tone, the logical self-contradictions, the images that reveal different meaning to different ages, all demonstrate Swift's belief that man and his environment are desperately complicated, and that any attempt to reduce them to simple schemes, whether the reduction be in terms of politics, science, history, psychology, literary theory or critical practice, only demonstrate his limitations more clearly. So, Swift, in a nutshell, uses the imaginary voyages as an instrument for his satire on mankind, reflecting the morals, social habits, political events and ideals, and exposing the hypocrisy. The fantastically inventive fictional world which he creates, through which he attacks the futility of science, which if not applied for human betterment in its widest sense, can only create more harm and chaos. That would be all.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on Gulliver Travels. And friends, we believe that your feedbacks, your questions are very, very important for us. So do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We promise to meet you again soon and would be discussing more. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thank you.